So we've been talking a lot about steepness and slope. So we're going to look more in depth at slope. Slope is really just what we've been calling rate of change. So those two can be used interchangeably. Usually if it's some sort of word problem or an actual real life context, we refer to it as rate of change, and slope would be more if it's not involving a word problem or real life context. The letter M is used to indicate the slope. The formulas are all the same for slope. It's the change in the y values divided by the change in the x values. The y's are the dependent and the x's are the independent. It's also the rise over the run if you're making a rate triangle. And if you have actual numbers given to you, you can calculate the rise or the change in y's by taking the second y, subtracting the first y. And if you're calculating the run, which is the change in the x's, you can take the second x and subtract the first x. So these are the formulas you're going to need to remember. Now we're going to look at some examples, and in all of these examples, they are dealing with just 2 points. So they don't involve a real world context or a word problem. They're just 2 points. So the easiest formula to use is this formula, because you'd be using these variables here to substitute the 2 points in. So the first thing you need to do when you have a question is to identify the 2 points. So the negative 2, 8 would be your first point. So that's the x coordinate of the first point, and that's the y coordinate of the first point. And in the second point, that's the x coordinate of the second point, and that's the y coordinate of the second point. You always want to start with your formula. So your formula is y2 minus y1, which will calculate how much the y values have changed. And that's divided by x2 minus x1, which will calculate how much the x values have changed. So that's the first step. So to calculate it, the first step is to write out the formula first. The second step is going to be to substitute in the values. So in this step, what we're going to do, make sure you're lining up your equal signs as always. And when you substitute in, y2 is negative 4, because that is the second y value. So it's y2 minus y1. So it's negative 4 minus 8 over x2 is 6 minus x1 is negative 2. Now you evaluate the numerator and the denominator. So in the top, negative 4 minus 8 is negative 12. And in the bottom, please remember and be careful of your negatives. When you're subtracting a negative, that makes a positive. So 6 subtract negative 2 is actually 6 plus 2, which makes 8. And then as always, you're going to put your fraction into lowest terms and leave it as an improper fraction. Rates of change should only be changed to decimals if you are either told or if it is a word problem and or a real life context. So like that. So what you want to remember, fractions only. No decimals, please. You want improper or proper. No mixed numbers, please. Needs to be in lowest terms. And your negative sign must be in the numerator. If there is one. So that would be your answer, negative 3 over 2. Now, if you wanted to see what this looked like, you could always sketch a graph. And negative 2, 8 would be around here. And 6, negative 4 would be around here. And that's what your line would look like. And you can see it is a negative slope. So just to recap, the first thing you do is you write out the formula. So that's here. The second step is to substitute the numbers in. And that step is here. And the third thing that you would do is to evaluate the numerator and the denominator, which is right here. And then lastly, make sure that you put your fraction in lowest terms, improper fraction, and negative sign in the numerator if applicable. Now the important thing too is if the denominator is a 1, you would leave your answer as an integer. And no decimals unless indicated. So let's talk about that integer thing because a lot of people leave the denominator as 1. So if you calculate the slope and you get something like 6 over 1, you would write that as 6. You would not leave it as 6 over 1. You would leave it as 6 because that's in lowest terms. So let's take a look at the next example. We'll first identify our points. So this is the x value of the first point, the y value of the first point. This is the x value of the second point and the y value of the second point. Write out the formula. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And now substitute. y2 is 8, so the second y is 8, and the first y is 3, over the second x is negative 6, and the first x is negative 6. Now we evaluate. In the numerator, 8 minus 3 is 5, and in the denominator, remember, subtracting a negative makes a positive. So negative 6 subtract negative 6 makes negative 6 plus 6. And negative 6 plus 6 is 0. So the denominator is 0. Now, if you calculate this in your calculator, if you tried typing in 5 divided by 0 in your calculator, you would get an error. And here's the reason why. If you were to graph this, the point negative 6, 3 would be about here. The point negative 6, 8 would be about here. And that, as you can see, is a vertical line. Think of this almost like downhill skiing. What kind of a slope would that be? That really wouldn't be a ski slope. That would be a cliff, and you would probably not survive. There really is no ski slope that's going to look like that. So in that case, there really is no slope because there is no run. So a vertical line has no slope to it, just like you'd never find a ski slope that looks like that. So we say that this is undefined. And this is really important to remember that anytime you get a denominator of 0, it is an undefined slope, which basically means there is no slope. And in the last example of question 1, or question A. Again, we're going to identify our 2 points. This is the x-coordinate of the first point, the y-coordinate of the first point. This is the x-coordinate of the second point, and the y-coordinate of the second point. Use our formula. Always write down the formula first. y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And we're going to substitute. The second y is 5. Subtract the first y, which is 5. And on the denominator, the second x is 7. And you're going to subtract the first x, which is negative 2. When you simplify that, in the numerator, 5 minus 5 is 0. And in the denominator, 7 subtract negative 2. Again, when you're subtracting a negative, it becomes a positive. So that becomes 7 plus 2, which is 9. Now in this case, you have the 0 in the numerator. So when you have the numerator equal to 0, you actually are able to calculate in that calculator. 0 divided by 9 is 0. So the slope is 0. So please remember the difference here. If the 0 is in the denominator, your slope is undefined. If the 0 is in the numerator, let's see what that looks like in a picture. Negative 2,5 is around here. 7,5 is around here. So that makes a horizontal line. So a horizontal line would have a slope of 0, and it means that the rise is equal to 0, and that's in the numerator, and it makes the slope 0. A vertical line means there is no run, so the denominator is 0, and you can't divide by 0, so that means the slope is undefined. So those are important to know because a lot of people get those mixed up. So a couple things to go over. A line is positive if the slope is increasing. We've talked about that before with rates of change. It's a negative slope if the line is decreasing. Again, we've talked about that with rates of change. So what's new here is the slope of a horizontal line is 0. And that occurred in this example right here. And that will happen when the numerator is 0, because a horizontal line has a rise of 0, which means the 0 is on the top. The slope of a vertical line is undefined. And that happened in this example. And this will happen when the denominator is 0, because a vertical line has a run of 0, which puts the 0 on the denominator. And since you can't divide by 0, you would get an error in your calculator, so there is no slope. Now, the next couple of questions will deal with question A. So we're going to be focusing on the slope that we have here in question A, which is negative 3 over 2. So the slope we had in question A was negative 3 over 2. Now, the slope of a parallel line is going to be equal. So parallel lines have equal slopes. So the way you write this is M for slope, and then you're going to write 2 vertical lines like this. That's not the number 11, it's 2 vertical lines, and it's a symbol that indicates parallel. So this here means the slope of parallel line. If it's going to be equal, then it's also going to be equal to negative 3 over 2. So this symbol here means the slope of a parallel line. In this question, again, we're going to be referring to the slope in question A, which is -3/2. A perpendicular line would have what we call opposite reciprocal slopes. So that means the slope is the opposite sign, and it is the reciprocal, which means you flip it upside down. So the slope, letter M, and the symbol for reciprocal looks like an upside down capital T. And that is equal to, so you have to change the sign. So the sign was negative, so now it's going to be positive. And you don't have to write the positive if you don't want to. But I just want to emphasize here that the sign is changing from negative to positive. And then you need to flip the fraction upside down. So instead of 3/2, it's going to be 2/3. And that would be the slope. So this here means the slope of a perpendicular line. All right, and the very last thing you need to know about slope is steepness. So again, we're referring to the slope in A, which is -3/2. And what we're looking for is a slope that is steeper than the line in question A. So in this case, for it to be steeper, all it means is the magnitude, which means just the number, and ignore the sign. So it doesn't matter what the sign is. The sign could be positive or negative. It doesn't matter. What it means is the number part, so 3/2, for it to be steeper, the slope would have to be bigger than 3/2. If the line was less steep, the slope would have to be less than 3/2. And 3/2 is 1.5, 1.5. So basically you're going to pick anything that is bigger in magnitude than 3/2. So for example, it could be -6. The sign doesn't matter. It's just if the number is bigger. Or it could be +4. Basically, any number bigger than 3/2. All right, so let's just review these properties. So the slopes of parallel lines are equal, and you saw that in this example here. And the slopes of perpendicular lines are opposite reciprocals, which means you change the sign and flip the numerator and the denominator upside down. So you saw that in this example. And the last thing was the higher the magnitude, which is just the number only, the steeper the line, the bigger the slope. And you saw that in this example here.